Welcome to week 3 of the history of war. This week we'll be looking at war and early civilization. In the background, you see a hill in Syria, about 100 miles north of Damascus and about 50 miles east of the Mediterranean Sea. Except that it's not a hill at all, not a true hill, but rather a tell, spelled T-E-L-L, a term that archaeologists use to describe a mound that is created when generations of people live on the same site for hundreds or thousands of years. What you're looking at is specifically Tel Nebi Mend. Archaeologists began excavating Tel Nebi Mend in the 1920s and discovered that human beings have occupied the site since the 7th millennium BCE. BCE stands for before Common Era. And that is to say, human beings have been on that site for about 9,000 years. What the original inhabitants called the site, we do not know. But during recorded history, it has always been called Kadesh. And it is famous as the site of the Battle of Kadesh, fought in May 1274 BCE between the armies of Pharaoh Ramses II of Egypt and King Muwatalli II of the Hittite Empire. To military historians, the battle is important because it is the earliest for which we have records that allow us to describe and analyze the fighting in detail. But it was anything but the first battle, because as soon as human beings invented writing, they already had something to write about: war. Okay. Here are the terms for today's presentation. By the end of this lesson, this presentation, you should understand the beginnings of organized warfare, the emergence of Bronze Age civilizations, the 3 stages of war in early civilization, the types of soldiers that were important during this period, so spearmen, archers, charioteers, cavalry, and so on. Okay. The causes, conduct, and consequences of early warfare, and finally the concept of grand strategy. Now, in this presentation, I'm going to give you an overview of warfare as it emerged in the Fertile Crescent from about 3000 BCE down to 500 BCE. And obviously, we're dealing with a huge swath of time. That's 2,500 years. And to do it, to handle it, I'm going to have to do a lot of oversimplifying. When I teach a survey course like this one, I sometimes feel as if I'm telling a series of lies, because everything is far more complex than I'm going to make it out to be. And as soon as I say something, I think of all these different qualifiers to that particular statement that there are. But we all have to start somewhere. And the most important thing to offer you is an introduction that doesn't just leave you confused. So we're going to keep things simple. The Fertile Crescent was one of 3 so-called cradles of civilization. The other 2 were the Indus River Valley, roughly on the border between present-day Pakistan and India, and the Yangtze and Yellow River valleys in present-day China. All 3 emerged around 3000 BCE, and all 3 were able to smelt and use bronze, an alloy made of copper and tin that was about as strong as iron and useful for a variety of contexts where you needed to have a metal object. Iron was a known metal back then, but while iron ore was plentiful, much more plentiful than copper or tin, the knowledge of how to forge iron, particularly the ability to generate and control enough heat, which is something on the order of 1500 degrees Fahrenheit to make iron into usable metal. This technology would not emerge until about 1000 BCE. Well, before we can talk about civilization, of course, in the Fertile Crescent or any place else, we have to talk about when it first emerged. Now, notice the two places indicated by red dots. Take the first one in the upper left-hand corner of the screen first. That difficult to spell word is pronounced Çatalhöyük, and it's in present-day Turkey. This is what it looks like. Excavations at Çatalhöyük began in 1958, and we know from those excavations that this was a late Neolithic settlement dating back to about 6700 BCE. It's about 32 acres in size. When I say Neolithic, of course, I'm talking about the New Stone Age. I'm talking about the period before the beginning of the Bronze Age. So we're getting to a point where human societies are more complex, but not yet at the level of an actual civilization. Still, you're talking about a substantial place. This is a recreation, of course, based on what Çatalhöyük looked like, the height of its population, which probably reached about 6,000 persons between 6700 and 5700 BCE. It consists of adjoining multi-room houses. Now notice the lack of doors. People used ladders to get onto roofs and entered their houses through openings at the top. Why do they do it that way? The answer, we think, is straightforward. Security. They had a lot of stuff to protect in Çatalhöyük, and they wanted to protect it. By living close together, the people could mutually protect one another. Remember, these are still all farmers. These are not really urban dwellers, and yet they work the fields during the day, and then they come back into Çatalhöyük, these houses that are all cheek by jowl next to each other in the evening. But they come together, not because it makes the most sense in terms of access to their fields and so forth. They come together partly for community, but a lot of it is for protection. And the contiguous dwellings created a de facto wall. And so the ladders that gave access to Çatalhöyük into the individual dwellings, these could all be retracted if an enemy approached. And if an enemy tried to get into Çatalhöyük by battering down one of the outer walls, the enemy would find himself not inside the town, but inside just a single room. So this is really a very effective way of organizing a settlement for security in what was probably already then a dangerous world. The second red dot is Jericho, in the present day west bank of the Jordan River, between Jordan and Israel, an area controlled by the Palestinian National Authority. Jericho is a substantial town today, but it's even older than Çatalhöyük. It dates back to about 9,000 BCE, that is to say 11,000 years ago. And like Çatalhöyük, it too was built of multi-room dwellings. But it also had a system of walls that dates back to the origins of the settlement. And it's been postulated that the walls were for flood control. But if so, it seems likely that they were also for defense. Well, who did the people living in Çatalhöyük and Jericho have to worry about? We don't know for sure, but the evidence suggests that it would have been nomadic raiders rather than people from another large agrarian settlement. Now let's look east from Jericho to Mesopotamia, a Greek word meaning land between the rivers, specifically the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Mesopotamia essentially corresponds to present-day Iraq and Syria. The earliest civilization, Sumer, was here. And when recorded history begins, Sumer consists of several cities. In the centuries that followed, a number of kingdoms and empires succeeded one another in Mesopotamia. The exact sequence is just plain bewildering if taught to you too rapidly. It'd be like trying to drink water from a fire hose. But for our purposes, it really isn't necessary. For Mesopotamia, I want you to bear in mind just 3 empires. Babylonia, strictly speaking, the first Babylonian empire, which is dated from 1894 to 1595 BCE. Assyria, strictly speaking, the Neo-Assyrian Empire, 911 to 609 BC. Persia, again, if you want to be scholarly about it, the first Persian Empire, 559 to 486 BCE. And then also I want you to know Egypt, specifically the New Kingdom, 1550 to 1077 BCE. Egypt, of course, is located at the other end of the Fertile Crescent in the Nile River Valley. We're talking about the first civilizations, but what is a civilization? The key characters include, first, an urban revolution. Cities become the focal points for political, economic, religious, and sociocultural development. You've got farmlands surrounding the cities, of course, and there's a lot going on there, but it's mostly has to do with keeping that city up and running, supplied, fed, and a center of power. Second, you have a distinct religion with a priestly class that, among other things, legitimizes the power structure. Third, you have a new social structure built on economic power with social classes. You would have an elite, king, nobility, priesthood. Then you would have another class of commoners, which is consisting of farmers, artisans, craftspeople, and then another class below that, slaves. Typically people who had been captured in war or had been sold into slavery or sold themselves into slavery on account of debt. Then you also, another element in the creation of civilization is the development of writing for record keeping. And perhaps in this category, you could also include significant new forms of artistic and intellectual activity, monuments, literature, and so on. But definitely you need to have writing. And finally, you have political centralization. And what that means is a king or a pharaoh or emperor and so on. A bureaucracy that provides administrative span of control. And then a state that has the characteristic of a monopoly on violence. Okay. So basically only the king and the nobility and his adherents, all had access to the recourse of organized violence. Now we think of the term civilization and civilized in favorable ways. Civilization connotes a high degree of technological and cultural advancement. Civilized suggests cultural refinement and moral restraint. So it's something of a bitter irony to recognize that civilization owes itself to violence, because only by violent means could one leader gather into his grip the concentration of cities, population, and wealth required to generate civilization. Here, for example, is the Palette of Narmer, which commemorates the triumph of King Narmer, the first pharaoh, in uniting Upper and Lower Egypt to create the Kingdom of Egypt around 3100 BCE. The slate is 25 inches high, and it has symbolic illustrations on both sides. On the reverse side, shown at left, there's a lot going on in it, but for our purposes, it's enough to know that the large figure wielding a mace is King Narmer, and that he is about to use it to sacrifice an opponent to the falcon god of Horus. On the obverse side, on the right, the action is at 3 levels. At the top, King Narmer is examining the headless bodies of his enemies under the standards of his army. The 2 long-necked creatures in the middle represent the 2 halves of Egypt, now restrained from fighting because King Narmer has united them. And then at the bottom, the bull of Narmer destroys the fortified site of a foe. So this palette of Narmer is a concise, powerful expression of the shotgun marriage of 2 regions to create a civilization. Now, there are 3 stages of war in early civilization. And again, this is just an incredible, breathtaking, jaw-dropping simplification, but hey, I can live with it if you can, and I'm pretty sure you can. The first stage is warfare focused on siegecraft and city defense. The second is offensive warfare based on the war chariot. And then what succeeds that is offensive warfare based on heavy infantry. Let's say ground troops. The ground troops is what is meant by infantry. Now, this is Babylon, the city of Babylon, the capital of Babylonia during the reign of King Hammurabi, who is well known for the system of laws created during his reign called the Code of Hammurabi. The ruins of Babylon are located on the site of modern Baghdad. At its height, however, Hammurabi's empire controlled all of Mesopotamia. Surrounding the city, you see extensive agricultural land supplied with water via a sophisticated grid of irrigation canals, which required strong political leadership and administrative span of control to create and maintain. In other words, it would require a civilization to create and sustain that sophistication of irrigation canals on which extensive agriculture in that part of the world depended. In Babylonia, as with all ancient civilizations, about 90% of the population, maybe even more, was engaged in farming, primarily just to feed themselves. In the United States today, something between 1% and 2% of the American population is engaged in agriculture, and that small sliver of population is able to generate enough crops and foodstuffs, meat, and so on, to supply not only the needs of this entire country, but a substantial part of the world. So we're at a very different stage right now. For most of human history, though, right down to the middle of the 19th century, just 150 years ago, most people were farmers. And in the ancient world, again, the figure is about 95%, leaving only about 5% of the population to be specialists in anything other than farming. There simply wasn't enough agricultural surplus to feed more than 5% of a kingdom's population that wasn't spending their full time growing the crops to feed themselves. This 5% of specialists in a civilization, this 5% would have included the king, the nobility, the priesthood, and the many servants, scribes, artists, and so forth who worked for the king, the nobility, and the priesthood, as well as skilled artisans and craftspeople. It would also have included full-time soldiers. But since full-time soldiers would have been expensive to maintain and necessarily few in number, there's only so many people you can get into that 5% who can afford not to be engaged in agriculture. Because full-time soldiers would have been expensive, in short, the focus of war was initially on city defense, to defend the wealth of a given city or to capture it by means of siegecraft, which involved either surrounding and starving out the city or else breaching the high city walls with battering rams and similar weapons, which were only developed over a long period of time. But although there would be expeditions setting forth from cities and from kingdoms and so on, if you want to neck it down to one form of warfare predominating, it's wars centering on defending or capturing cities. Because city defense did not require a great deal of skilled warriors, the first kingdoms relied upon conscripts, that is to say, men taken from the fields for a period of weeks or months, given a spear and enough organization and training to be adequate for the job. The business end of the spears were made of bronze, that alloy of tin and copper that came into use around 3000 BCE and gave its name to the Bronze Age. Otherwise, you are looking at a weapon that any caveman would have known how to use. There's nothing remarkable about it. Now, these are wooden model soldiers found in the tomb of an Egyptian provincial governor who lived around 2000 BCE. And it's an important source for Egyptian weaponry. So a great deal of what we understand about Egyptian weaponry during this period is by the close study of these wooden soldiers. The collection includes about 40 Egyptian spearmen, and those are shown here, but also 40 Nubian archers armed with simple bows. The spearmen would likely have been conscripts. The Nubians were paid mercenaries and drawn from Nubia, a land of nomads to the south of Egypt. And the reason why we know that they're from Nubia is because of the complexion of their skin. It's obviously quite dark. These are what we would now think of as Africans in the sort of the sub-Saharan Africa sense of that ethnography. These Nubians were not spearmen, of course, but to repeat a point, they were archers. And to be an archer required more skill than to be a spearman, which is why the Egyptian government, the Egyptian king, Pharaoh, was willing to pay to have them. But these archers were armed with simple bows. And for archers to become really significant in warfare required a major technological development, the invention of the composite bow. And to understand the importance of this, watch the video that follows.